There you go.
Okay. Can you see it?
Yep.
Good afternoon and welcome everyone. I'm Betsy Hatfield, Executive Director of Preservation Kentucky, and I'm delighted that you were able to join us for our webinar today, and thank you for attending. Today's webinar is the second of a series we're offering for Preservation Month and will continue offering throughout the year. Our webinar series is being made possible by a grant from Brown-Forman, and this grant also helped update our new website and expand the knowledge base and educational materials offered on our site. So I hope you'll take the time to visit it and utilize the publications and information on it. www.preservationkentucky, all spelled out, nothing abbreviated.org. There's also a calendar on our site of upcoming events and webinars and a way for you to sign up for our newsletter if you haven't already done so. There's also a section on funding and grant opportunities. We will upload today's webinar to our website and we'll share the link with you so that you can review it again. You can ask questions throughout the webinar by submitting them in the question section of your control panel. Be sure to send them to the organizer only so that Dan and I can see them, and we'll answer your questions immediately following Dan's presentation. Again, the question section is in your control panel and you can submit the questions there. Dr. Vivian is a professor of public history at the University of Louisville, a former historian with the National Register of Historic Places program in Washington, D.C. He also teaches courses in historic preservation and coordinates the department's public history program. Dr. Vivian specializes in the history of the United States after the Civil War. His current research concentrates on historical memory of slavery between the world wars. His book manuscript, A New Plantation World, The Leisure Plantations of the Carolina Lowcountry, 1880 to 1940, examines the relationship between historical memory, material change, and new patterns of social and cultural activity in the era when the Low Country gained new prominence. A New Plantation World book from Cambridge University Press will be out early next year. Dr. Vivian earned a Bachelor of Arts degree with a major in history and a minor in geography from the University of Alabama and a PhD in history from the Johns Hopkins University. He has been a professor and director of public history at the University of Louisville since July 2010. And this July, he heads to Lexington, where he'll serve as the new chair of the Department of Historic Preservation in the College of Design at the University of Kentucky. So if you'll join me in welcoming Daniel, I'm going to change the screen here. Okay, Daniel.
Okay, I think that went.
There you go.
Okay, and you can now see my screen, correct?
Correct.
Okay, so let me get the presentation up. Thank you for your very, very nice introduction, Betsy. And I'm very excited to have the opportunity to do this today, and I look forward to your questions. Again, please submit those via the question panel, and I will answer those probably after I get through the slide presentation. I'm going to talk for, I think, about 35 or 40 minutes, and the talk can be titled a couple different things. Why preserve, or why we preserve, is, you know, obviously the way it's been promoted and publicized. The other way I think about this is, you know, maybe something along the lines of demystifying preservation, okay? And what I mean by that is, I think preservation has lots of different meanings to public audiences, some favorable, many not so. And when we talk about preservation, we're actually talking about an incredibly broad range of different activities that go under a single label that public audiences know and are maybe somewhat familiar with, but you know, it's a fairly specialized realm of endeavor in many ways. As people that are interested in preservation and interested in doing quality preservation work, we can certainly do a lot better in terms of talking about it clearly and effectively. So part of what this talk tries to do is boil all the technicalities down to some nuts and bolt language and really focus on why I think preservation matters, generally speaking, to communities nationwide, and what the sort of bottom line is. And so that's the way I want to set this up. I hope that helps you think about what I'm going to present, and hopefully that will prompt some of the questions that will help us focus the discussion later on. There are lots of different rationales for historic preservation, right? Those of you that have studied it or been to workshops to some extent are familiar with them, you know, these all matter. Okay, the historical value of particular sites, an event or some sort of association with a particular place, architectural and aesthetic value, lots of different ways that's assessed, and many of us in the field spend a lot of time working on those sorts of questions. When we talk about preservation, again, I think we're talking about an incredibly broad range of activity, and as to what actually constitutes preservation and what is simply reuse of an existing building or site that has some historical value to it, but not necessarily particularly strong or well-known value. You know, in lots of ways, convenience is one of the factors that inspires preservation activity, right? It's easier to rehabilitate a particular building rather than build new. Whether it constitutes preservation is a subjective question, right? I mean, the tendency, I think, amongst many people in the public writ large is to think about preservation as meaning museum quality restoration, very important sites and buildings that are being treated very reverently. And, you know, there's certainly that part of the field, but by and large, people that specialize in preservation aren't thinking particularly aren't focused on those kinds of properties. I mean, the field has got it much broader, and we're very, very interested in average buildings, vernacular architecture, neighborhoods that simply have some degree of historical character dating from a certain period. So that covers a much broader range of historical resources, and thinking differently about them and what the possibilities are is really quite different from, again, those kind of museum quality restoration projects and very high style or important buildings that get that kind of treatment. You'll note in the middle of the screen, I've got this statement: radical change disorients environments created through incremental development are adaptable, inclusive, and resilient. There's a lot of interesting new research coming out about why certain material environments, whether that's a neighborhood, a commercial district, a particular place, you know, why people feel better physically, emotionally, and otherwise in those kinds of settings rather than other environments. And what this research is showing is that environments that have developed organically over time, where there's been incremental addition of new buildings, landscape features, and there's a sort of evolutionary pattern of development, those are much more appealing to human beings than environments that are totally created new. You can think about this in pretty bare bones terms, right? When I go out to the suburbs and I hit Walmart and have to do my shopping and I go to the mall, you know, I don't feel particularly drawn to the parking lot at a strip mall. I go there, I need to do certain things there, but in terms of feeling drawn in and interested in an environment, I'm much more interested and much more attuned to the immediate environment when I'm walking through a historic neighborhood in the evening, or I'm driving through and taking stock of the architecture. So the point being, we've learned through experience that when efforts are made to radically transform physical environments, those often prove more disorienting and alienating than inclusive and reassuring. Environments that have a sort of organic pattern of evolution are much more adaptable, offer a lot more to communities than might appear on the surface. Last couple points. Creativity. look, to rehabilitate an existing building, to adaptively reuse a building and think about new possibilities, there's tremendous creativity involved there. And much of the very creative work that happens in architecture writ large is adaptive reuse or rehabilitation projects. Now, certainly new building design can be incredibly creative, but I think there's a tendency to undervalue the creativity that goes into preservation. Lastly, 2 points that I'm going to talk about quite a bit more here: economics and concern for environmental resources / sustainability. These are major points of focus, have been major points of focus for a long time, but they're growing increasingly important, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about both here in a minute. Economics. People specialize in the economics of historic preservation, and this gets very, very detailed, very nuanced, but in general, there are a number of reasons why historic preservation is an incredibly good economic value for the communities where it's happening. And I'll run through these relatively quickly. Some of the handouts speak to these more directly. Number one, new construction versus rehabilitation. New construction is materials intensive. Renovation or rehabilitation is labor intensive. What that means in a nutshell is that a renovation project has a lot more economic bang for the buck in a local economy than new construction. When you're buying materials from a retailer, you know, if I'm buying sheetrock and framing timber and whatever else I need, you know, those are produced by national corporations that are marketing on a large scale, and the money I'm spending on them is largely flowing outside of the immediate area. If I fund a restoration project and I'm paying people to do paint scraping and fine carpentry and repair wooden windows, that's all labor. And so those labor expenditures mean that people that live in the area are getting money that they then take to the grocery store, they then spend it on rent or mortgage, they spend it on other businesses locally. There's much more secondary and tertiary value to the spending on the individual project, okay? So in a nutshell, preservation is almost always a much bigger economic impact than new construction, and it comes down to that difference between materials and labor. Rehabilitation effectively means you're buying locally. So the same economics that make good sense about shopping at locally owned businesses rather than national chains, again, the economic impact is bigger. Second key point, preservation of any kind is generally, it's taking place where there are already buildings, right? There's already been development. It is making use of existing infrastructure. It means that nobody has to run a new sewer line, create new roadways, provide services like 911 and policing. It is a much better value for communities rather than taking in new territory into the municipality and having to support the infrastructure costs associated with it. In general, we should have much stronger incentives for infill construction, whether it's historically sensitive or not, frankly, because it takes advantage of existing infrastructure. It doesn't require the kind of outlays that are associated with new development on the periphery of communities. Property values. Preservation stabilizes property values. It tends to actually benefit the properties that are affected by it. There's a lot of research on this dimension of preservation. Municipal leaders often don't believe all of it, in my experience, but it's very convincing, and I'm happy to share citations and some of the material that I think is very interesting. What the data shows is that neighborhoods that are designated historic, whether by local ordinance or listing in the National Register of Historic Places, and this holds true for individual listings as well, they tend to hold their property better over time. They lose less value in an economic downturn. and the rate of appreciation is generally higher than the community average overall. This holds true regardless of the sort of socioeconomic ranking within the community. It holds true for low-income neighborhoods that are listed as historic, as well as very well-to-do neighborhoods that are listed in that fashion. What the data shows overwhelmingly, and again, this is a very large body of literature that has data from a lot of different communities at this point, historic preservation is a stabilizer of property values and a benefactor of property values. Now, community leaders sometimes see that as counterintuitive because in some cases, not all, but a historic district will be governed by regulations that require you to take proposals for alteration or even just repairs in kind to an architectural review board of some sort, right? You've got to get permission to do work on a property in a historic district because the idea is that you want to preserve the overall character. And so because people are giving up a measure of their leeway to do what they want to their property, municipal officials will often say, well, you know, this seems counterintuitive that the property values increase. That control, that oversight of repair, that character maintaining factor is actually crucial to the reasons that property values stabilize and appreciate at a higher rate over time. So huge body of information, very, very compelling. A couple last points here on the economic side of things. First of all, there are incentives for historic preservation. And here in Kentucky, we're fortunate to have the federal tax credit for rehabilitation available, but we also have a state tax credit that can be piggybacked on the federal credit for commercial projects. It's also available for residential projects. And if you don't know about it already, you can Google Kentucky Heritage Council, which is the designated state historic preservation office. The tax credit information on the website boils down those incentives that are available and are well worth thinking about. Other communities have minor incentives that are available. Louisville, for instance, has a property abatement for certain, or property tax abatement for certain types of properties, but the tax credits that are available at both the state and federal level are the main ones to be thinking about. Last point is, and again, this ties back into the point about organically developed environments that I mentioned previously. There's a large body of new research that shows that environments where there is a high level of urban vitality, a lot of different businesses that are open not just during the sort of traditional business hours, but into the evening, on weekends. If you've got diversity of building use and occupancy, a mix of residential and retail, these older, smaller, better neighborhoods are showing that, you know, vitality centers on neighborhoods that have developed organically over time, that have a wide range of different building sizes and buildings from widely varying ages, okay? And so, you know, one example that I'm very familiar with here in Louisville that some of you hopefully know about is Bardstown Road, right? Bardstown Road in the section between sort of the east side of downtown and the Watterson Expressway, you know, that is an incredibly vibrant urban neighborhood. It is not particularly historic. Portions of it are within locally and nationally designated districts, and there are some historic buildings on that corridor, but for the most part, what it exemplifies is this diversity of building occupancy, businesses, residences, building sizes, ages. It's developed organically, and that's where its vibrancy comes from. This is the kind of environment where lots of different businesses can find footing and do well. People can walk to it. They don't have to drive. They linger longer. They can go eat in the evening as well as shop at boutiques during the day. These neighborhoods have vibrancy and economic vitality for pretty clear reasons once you begin looking at it. And that's worth thinking about, certainly worth cultivating if you're involved in preservation at a local level. There are lots of scenarios where preservation seems like a bad idea, and people will speak in opposition to it or assume pretty much right off the bat that it's not feasible, not a good idea, that there are better options. And there are certainly some cases where preservation of any kind is not as good a solution to the problem at hand as new construction. There are also much greater number of cases where preservation is assumed to be not an option or said to be not an option based on poor quality assumptions and reasoning rather than credible information. So I've got a couple scenarios outlined here. These are typical things you hear about from people, and there are plenty of others that we could go through. But the bottom line to these is, look, knowledge is power. And if I have a serious problem with my, with a tooth, and my dentist says, man, you've really got to go to a specialist, this is beyond me, I'm going to send you to an oral surgeon. Well, I believe he's telling me I've got to go to a specialist. If you're the municipal official on the second scenario here, and you're told that you can't possibly rehabilitate the historic city hall, but that's coming from a facilities manager that doesn't specialize in preservation or have any specialized knowledge of the field, or if it's coming from an architect who's very interested in in building something new, get a second opinion. Speak to contractors and architects, a preservation engineer who is knowledgeable and informed. Preservation doesn't have to be expensive. It's often much less expensive than new construction. It tends to be a better value than new construction because of quality of materials, because you're dealing with something where the history of the structure and the problems it's had over time. There are preservation solutions that are often not taken because of a general sense that preservation will be expensive, it won't yield as useful a building, and that efficiencies we need today because of energy consumption or technology, you just can't do it. And to that I'd say, look, there are very, very creative specialists in a lot of different fields that have figured this stuff out and continue to do so. How do you get T1 internet lines into historic buildings? How do you make historic buildings energy efficient without doing highly invasive, expensive treatments? There are solutions. It just comes down to talking to the right people and figuring out what the possibilities are. Sustainability is increasingly part of this nexus of both economics but also conservation. And there are several reasons why historic buildings are very effective values for sustainability and are very good environmentally in terms of use of resources. The first one is simply this concept of an embodied energy, which in a nutshell means, look, the greenest building is the one that's already built. You can design a new building, and there's good reason to be energy efficient and environmentally sensitive when you do that, and you can get a very high LEED rating, which is the architectural standard for using renewable materials and energy efficient systems and everything. But the building that's going to be most effective in not increasing the carbon footprint is the one that's already there. If you can rehabilitate it, that's going to be a much better value for the planet than building new under any terms. And there's a lot of information I can point people to as to why that is, how it works out in different scenarios, but that's the bottom line. If you can use an existing building, it is going to be more environmentally advantageous. Second of all, there's a great body of very serious, rigorous research, and I've got one of the handouts is a report called The Greenest Building, and what this research shows is a lot of the assumptions people make about efficiency in terms of heating and cooling and things of that nature the assumption is to tend to think that a new building can be made much more efficient. Turns out not to be particularly true. In general, the costs and the feasibility of retrofitting existing buildings for energy efficiency are almost always very good. They compare favorably or are significantly better than new energy efficient construction. There are few building types that can't be adapted at a good cost value. The one that comes to mind immediately that's often cited is warehouse to residential conversions. That tends to not work very well because you're having to put in so much new material and energy systems inside of a big box, basically, that turns out to be not cost effective as compared to new construction. But in terms of almost any other building type, the existing building can probably be retrofitted to be as energy efficient or very close to it. It can probably be done at less expense. It will probably be a much better return on investment than building that new energy efficient building. If you look at the data, what it finds is that it takes a very long time to recoup to benefit from the cost savings that come from more energy efficient new construction. So that varies a lot depending on what exactly we're talking about, but the data shows that compared to retrofitting an existing building, it's usually 10 years and sometimes as long as 80 or 100 before the payoff from building the new energy efficient structure begins to accrue, okay? And again, the environmental costs of that new construction are part of that equation as well. Last point here is that, look, preservation is a counterweight to typical business cycles. Real estate, people study this in detail, and there are many people that know a lot more about it than I do, but people invest in real estate often on what seems like a relatively short time horizon, but real estate cycles tend to be multi-generational and often in a range of 75 to 100 years. Preservation works two ways as a counterweight to the boom and bust cycle that tends to be how real estate markets work. And that is, first of all, preservation is about ongoing maintenance in part, and so upkeep and maintaining the utility and occupancy of existing buildings is a way of maintaining value over time and investing on an ongoing basis in a way that is going to sustain value over the long run. And so certainly that's part of it. Second of all, preservation, because rehabilitation in kind of a speculative fashion tends to target undervalued, neglected buildings and neighborhoods, places that are that have seen a cycle of disinvestment and are ripe for rehabilitation. That is countering the new development, the direction of new development in the community. It's a counterpoint to suburban development, new housing, strip malls, and so forth. So in a couple different ways, the sort of investment calculus that preservation uses is very healthy for the community overall, because again, it works against tendencies that are built into the market and that are going to be pronounced in most cases without that contrasting strategy. Last reason, and this is, I think, more important than we give it credit for, although once we go through the logic, the value, I think, is pretty evident. Preservation is about building community, right? Preservation gives particular neighborhoods, particular business districts, gives small towns and cities, people care about the places where they live. They want to be part of deciding how things are going to look, how things are maintained. They want to live in places that where there's evidence that people care about them, there's effort made to beautify them, maintain things they like about them. This is why any building project, whether we're talking about new construction or rehabilitation of existing building, any kind of building project of significant scale tends to generate pretty good public discussion and often debate. And that's actually, I think, very, very healthy. It shows that people care about where they live. They want to live in a place that is consonant with their values. And so in lots of different ways, preservation builds community. Certainly at the neighborhood level, preservation makes neighbors interact with one another. It generates interaction that's socially healthy. It gets people to know their neighbors, to have common concerns, to talk about them, to share dialogue about the issues. It promotes tolerance because people are interacting with other people with whom, that live nearby or have businesses nearby. It's promoting socialization in a very healthy and effective way, I think. It certainly creates what I call social and cultural resiliency. And again, this sounds a little esoteric, a little academic, but the academic research on this is pretty strong, and I find it very, very convincing. And what it boils down to is that preservation is about making commitments to certain places, right? If people are invested in particular neighborhoods, not just financially, but emotionally and intellectually, if they know the history of the community, if they like it because of the sort of environment that's there, because of the aesthetics, because it's got a mix of older buildings and new construction, whatever the case is, they're developing a bond with it, right? And that's very important in a globalized economy, a globalized society, a society where we have a high level of mobility. In many cases, people are going to make the choice to stay or work harder to stay in a certain location if they're very invested, again, emotionally, intellectually, and otherwise, in a particular neighborhood when job losses happen, when they lose a job because they're downsized. Is it as easy to pick up and go if you're living in a relatively homogeneous looking suburban apartment complex as compared to a house that you've taken the time to restore, and your neighbors are working along the same lines, and there's interest in the history of the neighborhood? That's a very, very different equation. So what anthropologists call place attachment, this makes particular communities socially and culturally resilient in a way that I think has yet to be fully appreciated. It doesn't have to happen through preservation, but preservation is a pretty good vehicle for doing it. And this is certainly going to be a focus of discussion in the years to come. Historical knowledge of any kind produces tolerance. It produces a perspective on contemporary events, produces empathy for others. Again, if preservation at one level is about helping people know more and better appreciate the history of the place where they live, that's a good thing with all sorts of different benefits that accrue over time. Lastly, I assume that quite a few of you are at least familiar with the Main Street program, and Kentucky's Main Street program is managed again by the Kentucky Heritage Council, the organization I mentioned earlier. This is a national program that grew out of early preservation efforts to counteract the commercialization of the suburbs, right? The movement of department stores and businesses that were traditionally downtown to suburban locations. And Main Street organizations are very effective in making sure that the main streets of small towns and even larger cities remain vital. It's an organizational strategy for keeping small businesses downtown, keeping businesses downtown in communities where the economic forces are actually encouraging different scenarios. And so Main Street is another one of the ways in which preservation builds community. It creates networks, it creates promotional strategies, it organizes events that bring people to particular locations in the community, it puts people proximate to historic buildings, helps them appreciate what those buildings and the environments in which they sit do. It's again part of this community building system. And again, I think a lot of these are underappreciated in terms of their social benefits, but if you start looking at them closely, preservation is an incredibly good vehicle for bringing people together in, I think, constructive ways. Okay, so this is the slide where, basically you say, yeah, this sounds good, Professor Vivian, but, if it were so good, why aren't more people doing preservation? Why don't we have more preservation, less new construction? Why is preservation as difficult as it seems to be? And I would say to that, there are a whole bunch of different reasons, right? And this is what we as people that are interested in reaping the benefits of preservation for communities throughout the Commonwealth need to be thinking about. Number one, again, preservation is an awfully complex thing, lots of different variations. So to talk about preservation in general, I don't know if I'm comfortable with that. I mean, again, there's a huge difference between a museum quality restoration of a particular building and something that's relatively modest but designed to keep an existing building in use and occupied. So a little bit more specificity is useful. There are quite a few barriers to good preservation work at any level. The American construction industry is a huge industry. It's a huge driver of the economy, and it is focused on new construction. It doesn't have to be this way, but that's the way it's developed over time, and that's the situation we find ourselves in. Now, certainly there are people that know how to do preservation and are good preservation contractors, craftspeople specialized in the restoration work, but the building industry writ large wants to build new buildings and has not focused as much on rehabilitation as it might. So that's problem number one. A lot of the thinking behind why new construction is preferred by many people, whether we're talking about commercial businesses, residences, or whatever, there's a lot of hubris behind that. The idea that new is better and that newer will be better as compared to rehabilitating an existing building. And I think that's a cultural problem we need to think about carefully, but it's something that is certainly part of the mix. I mentioned previously the tendency for real estate investments to be made on a somewhat short time horizon. A longer time horizon makes the benefits of preservation much, much more evident. Again, if we think about why new construction is favored, it's often favored in scenarios where people aren't taking into account the full costs. And so if we look at building maintenance, if we look at the initial cost of construction versus ongoing costs, look, a lot of buildings, especially commercial buildings that are built today, are not expected to last very long. They're probably planned on a life cycle of about 30 to 40 years. If a building is standing today, it's probably pretty well built, right? Any building that is from before World War II and probably even from before the 1960s, it's probably got a quality construction that's worth thinking about as compared to new construction, simply because of the quality of materials, the building's methods used in constructing it. Those are going to have real benefits in that cost-benefit analysis. Finally, and this is really important for people that are involved in planning or any kind of local leadership, when we think about why aren't more people doing preservation, and I've just run through this list of economic benefits, and I've talked about how it's superior to new construction and more environmentally friendly. One reason why, even with that calculus, the benefits of historic preservation are often underappreciated is that they're diffuse. If you're a building owner and you take the tax credit for rehabilitating a historic building, you see that on your, you see it in your bank account. You see that on your income tax form at the end of the year. If we talk about subsidiary spending because somebody has decided to do rehabilitation as opposed to new construction, and those benefits are, being translated through labor spending for the craftsmanship necessary to do the rehabilitation, the direct benefits to any one person are pretty low. Those are a lot of different businesses that spending is going towards, a lot of different mortgage lenders or landlords. It's pretty diffuse. Now, where it makes the most difference, or where people can best appreciate that diffusion and why it matters for a particular community, are people in positions of municipal leadership, right? If you're a mayor of a small town or a city council member and you actually understand why preservation is a good economic value, you're going to be all for preservation because it does have substantial benefit, and those benefits are going to accrue within the community and benefit a lot of different people. So the fact is that, you know, preservation is not a clear economic benefit necessarily for any one person, but if you think about the aggregate benefits, that turns out to be pretty powerful. I've listed challenges here on the right side of the slide. I've probably touched on most of these already. There's certainly the fact that preservation is, again, thought of in certain ways by the public at large, and preservation therefore tends to be kind of undervalued because especially high style buildings that are rehabilitated and renovated don't get the attention they deserve, that sort of thing. So sort of cultural assumptions that play into what preservation is and isn't, that's certainly part of the equation. Certainly some of the social and cultural benefits are not as well appreciated as they might be. So a whole number of reasons why I think there's plenty of opportunity to talk more accurately and effectively about preservation and explain what all it does and think about broad community benefits. As far as opportunities go, I'm assuming you've signed into today's webinar because you're interested. I would suggest a number of different things, right? Now, number one, all preservation is local. It begins at the local level. That's where you can see its benefits most clearly. Get involved. Get involved with the local historic preservation organization. Get involved. If you're not a member of Preservation Kentucky already, you certainly should be. You should certainly be receiving their email updates about issues going on statewide. Find an organization that's not a preservation organization that's involved in historic preservation. There are a lot of those around. One of the organizations I have been most closely involved with in recent years and that I have enjoyed most and feel like I've done the most for is a nonprofit housing development organization that focuses on affordable housing. They sometimes combine affordable housing tax credits with preservation tax credits. Sometimes they don't. Sometimes they do new construction, but they mainly work in older neighborhoods in the historic core of Louisville, and you know they're focused on affordable housing. They're not necessarily focused on preservation, but they do an awful lot of good preservation work, and even when they're building new buildings, they're building them in a way that's sensitive to the location where they are, sensitive to the older buildings that are around them, and they're building within the city. They're revitalizing existing neighborhoods, making use of existing infrastructure. They like my expertise because I know something about preservation. Most of the staff is coming at these questions from an entirely different background, but we meet in the middle and we learn from each other, and the work gets done more effectively. So lots of different ways to get involved in preservation. Honest dialogue. Look, debate over communities is healthy. Many people, I think that preservation is controversial, and you know, whenever there's a preservation controversy, it's often billed as progress versus opposition to progress, and the preservation advocates get labeled as being opposed to progress. This simply isn't the case. It depends. It depends a lot on what problem we're talking about, who's proposing what kind of new construction might be put up if a older building is demolished, what the possibilities for that older building are, realistically speaking. We owe it to ourselves to be part of those debates, to participate in them, and then talk in an informed way about individual problems, projects, proposals, because you know, to label new construction as progress and preservation as opposition to progress, this just isn't accurate. It's not reasonable. It's not what the information tells us. A lot of complexities that just don't fall into those two categories, and we need to think about more carefully. The other thing I'd say is, well, there are a lot of organizations ready to help, national, state, and local organizations. There's a tremendous amount of information available online. If you're interested in a particular aspect of preservation, want to become more knowledgeable about a certain dimension of it, it will not be hard to get you in touch with the right literature or the right people to talk to. And certainly there's lots of opportunities along those lines. What does the future of preservation look like? Especially now that I've just encouraged everyone to become more involved, to participate more fully, to learn more, and do more in that regard. Well, I think it's probably going to become much more locally grounded, even more so than it already is. And there will continue to be state and national organizations that advocate for historic preservation of many different stripes. They'll remain important, but really the most benefits have always been at the local level, and they've mainly been secured by nonprofit organizations, whether preservation specific or not, municipal governments that are showing leadership and commitment to preservation in various ways, and landowners, property owners, developers that are preservation savvy, for-profit entities that see preservation as a good value and as something that's marketable. It's going to continue to be that way, and more, I think the biggest bang for the buck, the greatest return on effort expended, will be at the local level. Sustainability and questions about equity. One of the major political debates of our time is this question about inequality. The degree to which we have endemic poverty in American society, growing income inequality throughout the Western world. Preservation has a role to play in ameliorating some of that through more affordable housing, through extending the economic life cycle of particular buildings, making more equitable communities. The sustainability and equity equations go hand in hand. Preservation can't solve all of them. It's not going to put a dent in some of the big ones, but it does have a role to play there, and taking account of that is important, especially as we are more and more concerned about inequality, and then also these questions about environmental resources, environmental sustainability. Increasingly financial savvy, knowledge of how to combine different incentives is going to be important to the success of many preservation projects. Specialized knowledge counts, and being attuned to some of the information that's available, thinking about how people put together viable preservation projects when at first glance they seem economically impossible. That's going to be more and more important, and there are lots of creative people thinking about this, a lot of very, very creative accountants thinking about how to make certain projects work. Again, a little knowledge goes a long way, and this gets fairly specialized, fairly intricate, but if you understand how it's done, it's an eye-opener. It makes a lot of building projects look viable when at first glance they seem simply impossible. Lastly, one reason why the public still thinks in many cases of preservation as being about pretty white houses and big kind of monumental buildings is that preservation began with that kind of focus in the United States and elsewhere, and we've not done enough to work beyond it. Now, most people that are specializing in the field these days are very, very concerned about buildings and neighborhoods associated with historically disadvantaged communities. We're certainly very interested in telling more inclusive stories and preserving a wider range of resources, but that message has not gotten out as fully as it needs to, something that we certainly need to work on. Going forward, preservation has to be inclusive. If it's going to be economically advantageous, if it's going to be socially relevant, if it's going to be about bettering communities writ large, it's going to have to be about inclusion rather than exclusion. And by that I mean it's got to benefit the majority of people present in any given community. It's got to consider all the resources present and not just the very high style examples of particular architectural types or styles. It's got to be inclusive historically and as well at present, and that's the real promise of preservation going forward, it seems to me. A lot of different factors that play into that, but that's certainly worth looking towards as we think about preservation in the future. So with that, I'm going to conclude. We've got a couple questions here. I'm going to touch on the one that let me see here. So one of the questions says, we see so much misunderstanding of what preservation is, as you touched on. Many people don't realize their home or business might qualify for grants because they misunderstand what makes it important, a building important, i.e. it's not just high style. So many people overlook the importance of vernacular structures. We hear, well, there's nothing in this area, just a bunch of old residential buildings, farms, etc. How do we best educate the public at large about what preservation is? Excellent question. So the basic question is, if the public still has a lot of misapprehensions about preservation, how do we do a better job of educating? $64,000 question. I think a couple of different things. I think that we certainly have a lot of work to do, and a lot of people have a lot of work to do. And again, a lot of the cultural assumptions are things that we need to work against when public debates happen. And that can be a preservation controversy. It can be a controversy over a large new building project that's being proposed and discussed. But you know, a lot of our cultural assumptions are built on the idea that new is better, new is going to be more cost efficient, it's going to be a better economic value, it's going to create jobs. You know, you and I know how new building projects are sold, and you know, once one looks carefully at the return on investment and the overall economic benefit, I'm not that convinced that new construction is always better, or even that new construction in general is a good economic value for communities. So it seems to me that we need to work against some of those cultural assumptions in cases where we're not just debating saving a given building or a preservation issue, but we're instead talking about what communities focus on in terms of development in general. The second point I'd make is yeah, there's got to be better public education, and we have to work to get the message out and work against some of these cultural assumptions. But I also think we have to realize that we may never give the public a very good idea of what preservation is. To some extent, preservation is always going to be a pretty specialized realm where people with specialized knowledge and a language for dealing with it are talking to one another. It doesn't mean preservation can't become a bigger part of many communities. It doesn't mean that people won't see the benefits of preservation and think differently about it. But to some extent, you know, preservation involves a lot of technical knowledge and a lot of very specialized knowledge, and a lot of the discussions that are going to be part of what preservation is are always going to be done amongst, you know, specialists. So, you know, again, how do we work against some of the misapprehensions that the public in general has about historic preservation? We need a long-term strategy. We need to keep working at it. We certainly need to do better education at every available opportunity. We need to challenge assumptions about new construction, return on investment, energy efficiency of new buildings versus historic buildings that have been appropriately retrofitted. We all have lots to do. The evidence is there, and the debates can be effectively and persuasively, you know, the arguments can be made. Whether that means the public appreciation of preservation is ever going to be as fully developed as we want it to be, I'm a little skeptical along those lines, just because preservation is so skeptical. One of the comparisons that's made with the American preservation movement, some of you probably know this, is with the American environmental movement, right? The National Historic Preservation Act is passed at the same time that Americans are becoming very concerned about pollution, urban pollution, toxic substances in their environments, and the Clean Water Act and the Clean Air Act are passed, and Americans get very environmentally sensitive. Well, environmentalism is a much easier concept to grasp and support than preservation is by comparison. Again, it takes working against a lot of cultural assumptions and a lot of seemingly self-evident facts to appreciate the benefits of preservation. Pretty much everyone can understand why we want clean air and clean water, and we don't want to put pesticides in the soil. So there's a big difference there, and to what extent the public is ever going to be especially knowledgeable about preservation, I think that's an open question. But there's certainly a lot of education that needs to be done and continues to need to be done. That is the one question that's come in. If anybody wants to send more, please do. I will stay on the line for some time. I hope this has been useful. It's certainly been enjoyable for me to do. I hope it's been useful for you. If anybody wants to follow up with questions, I'm happy to answer them via email in the days that follow. I'd also point you to the several handouts that are available through the webinar. And let me just mention these. One is the executive summary for a report called Older, Smaller, Better that the National Trust has done, and this speaks about those kind of organically created neighborhoods, organically evolved neighborhoods, and why they are economically and socially vital. And so that's a great way to become better informed about that. I've created a list of recommended readings on historic preservation. Several of these are very recent books that I think are worth paying attention to. There are some others that are classics, but we're all about to go on vacation, hopefully at some point this summer, spend some time catching up on reading. These are my recommendations if you're interested in boosting your knowledge about preservation. I've also uploaded the National Trust report, The Greenest Building. This is a very, very detailed, very rigorous report on the economic and environmental benefits of rehabilitating existing buildings as compared to new construction. It's very detailed, but it's very compelling. It's very well worth looking at. Lastly, the Kentucky Heritage Council does preservation fact sheets for all of the congressional districts in the Commonwealth. And I've put one up online for District 1. You can go to the Kentucky Heritage Council website, download these preservation fact sheets. They're updated, I believe, quarterly. They are great because they synopsize economic benefits of preservation and activity in each congressional district. They're a good way to stay up on developments in particular parts of the state, but they're also a really good way to look at those aggregate effects. Again, if the economic benefits of preservation are often kind of diffuse, this is a good way to get an overall synopsis and think about economic benefits on a big picture scale in a way that elected officials, other municipal leaders, I think can understand and appreciate. So with that, I close. Thank you very much for participating and tuning in today. I've enjoyed doing this. And again, if you've got follow-up questions or want to get in touch with me, send a note to Betsy and she will facilitate that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dan. And I'm going to switch over here on the screen. And thank you all again for all of you for attending. We had a great response today, and I hope you'll join us for future webinars and events. And if you have any questions, there our phone number on the screen. I think all of you have my email from your registration. And then Daniel agreed to have us share his email with you. And there's his email if you want to jot that down. Our next webinar is next Thursday, the same time, 1 to 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, with Joseph Clare on the topic why historic preservation is important for economic development. So continuing the discussion on demystifying historic preservation and making it relevant and having people understand community-wide how it's a critical tool and driver for economic development, revitalizing neighborhoods and downtowns, generating funds for communities, putting people to work and keeping them in the workforce and putting vacant buildings back on the tax rolls. And Daniel, I want to thank you so much for taking the time to prepare this presentation for us and present it today. It was absolutely fabulous, very substantive. I'm looking forward to watching it again to kind of reabsorb some of the information you shared with us. And again, we thank you all for joining us today and hope to see you at some events in the future, and hope you'll join us for future webinars. And have a nice afternoon, everyone.